Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The early morning air in Eldenwood smelled like wet leaves and forgotten promises. Mist hung low over the crooked fences and dew-speckled grass, smothering the land in a hush that made even birds hesitate to chirp. A raven sat like a warning on a power line, head cocked as a black SUV cut through the narrow, uneven road that led toward the far edge of town. Behind the wheel sat Gregory Hammond, a man whose suit looked too polished for these parts, whose shoes had not known mud in years, and whose heart, though still beating, had long since stopped feeling. He hadn't stepped foot in Eldenwood since he was 17, and now, after 3 decades, he returned not as a son of the soil, but as its landlord. His gloved hand gripped the steering wheel like it owed him money. He wasn't here to reminisce or drink from memory's well. He was here for business, stern, swift, and final. The house on the deed was the last piece of this town he still owned, and its tenant hadn't paid rent in 8 months. He'd sent letters, notices, a warning call, but silence had answered him every time. Silence, as always, had a way of feeling personal. The house came into view like a ghost, emerging through the thickening fog. Time had gnawed at its bones, the once white paint now peeling like dry skin, the front porch sagging as if weary of standing. The windows, clouded with dirt and time, stared blankly at him like eyes that had seen too much and remembered even more. A solitary tire swing, barely hanging on, spun with the breeze, creaking softly like an old man mumbling in his sleep. Gregory parked, stepped out, and shut the door with a little too much force, the sound cracking through the silence like a judge's gavel. His shoes sank into the damp earth, and he frowned, as though nature had personally offended him. He straightened his jacket, adjusted his watch, and took long strides toward the porch with the eviction notice tucked under his arm like a weapon. He had expected resistance, a ranting tenant, perhaps an angry old man with a limp and a list of grievances, maybe even a group of squatters who needed to be told what a courtroom looked like. What he didn't expect was the faint sound of a child's laugh fluttering through the cracks in the door, light, innocent, and woefully out of place. He hesitated at the first step, not because he was second-guessing, but because something about that sound pressed a cold finger to the back of his neck. He climbed the steps anyway, each board groaning under his weight as if trying to warn him to turn back. With each stride, the air around him thickened, as if the very air of Eldenwood had decided he wasn't welcome. He raised his hand and knocked, once, firmly. The wood of the door felt warm under his knuckles, worn smooth by years of weather and skin. Inside, there was a pause. Then the slow shuffle of feet, the sound of a lock turning, and the soft click of hesitation. The door opened 2 inches, then 3, and then all the way. And there she stood. A woman in her late 20s, maybe 30, with tired eyes and a strong jaw set with silent resolve. Her dark curls framed a face that wore exhaustion like war paint. In her arms was a boy, maybe 4 or 5, wrapped in a faded blanket and clinging to her like a baby koala. The woman didn't cower or flinch. She looked him dead in the eye. There was no fear in her gaze, just the dull shine of someone too used to battles to cry over another. Gregory felt the paper in his hand grow heavier by the second. The boy shifted, lifting his head from the woman's shoulder. And that's when everything inside Gregory turned to stone. The child's eyes, green, wide, and startlingly familiar, pierced through his chest like a rusty nail. He had seen those eyes before. Not on this porch, not in this town. But years ago, in a summer so golden it hurt to remember. A summer when a girl with honey-colored laughter had leaned against his shoulder under the shade of a willow tree and told him she would wait. The boy looked like her. No, He looked like both of them. Gregory swallowed hard. The eviction notice, still in his grip, suddenly felt like a sin. The woman adjusted her grip on the boy and said, quietly but without shame, "You must be Mr. Hammond." His mouth opened to respond, but no words came. She looked down at the paper in his hand, then back at his face. "You've come to put us out." Not a question, not a plea. Just a fact spoken like a lullaby she'd memorized years ago. Gregory stepped back without a word, eyes never leaving hers, and walked down the porch steps like a man leaving his own funeral. The drive back into town was slower than before, not because the road had changed, but because something inside Gregory Hammond had. The car that had once felt like a ship of control, a sleek extension of his will, now felt more like a cage on wheels, too tight, too quiet. His fingers clenched the steering wheel like it could anchor his thoughts, but they floated everywhere, slipping through his grip like smoke. He wasn't thinking about the eviction anymore. The paper had stayed in his hand until he reached the car, where he crumpled it absently and dropped it into the passenger seat. His thoughts turned instead to the boy's eyes. They weren't just familiar, they were remembered. He'd seen them once on a girl who laughed at thunderstorms and called the rain sky tears. That laugh had long since fallen silent, buried somewhere in the attic of his youth, behind locked doors and boarded windows. Yet now, here it was again, reincarnated, not in voice, but in gaze. The mother hadn't said her name. Maybe she didn't feel it was worth mentioning. Maybe she knew that name would do more damage than the eviction ever could. As he drove past the rusted sign welcoming visitors to Eldenwood, his stomach turned, not from nausea, but from an ancient, unsaid truth, rising to the surface like a bloated body in still water. He pulled into the gravel parking lot of the Eldenwood Inn, a place where the floors creaked like they remembered everyone who ever walked them. The lobby hadn't changed since the 80s, faded wallpaper peeling like old wallpaper often does in buildings that forget time still exists. The man behind the desk gave him a half-hearted nod, chewing something that didn't seem to be gum. Gregory signed the guest book without speaking. He didn't want anyone to know he was staying. Not yet. His name still meant something here. Mostly resentment, maybe some respect, and definitely whispers. He wasn't here to stir the water. Not until he figured out what exactly it was that had pulled him into it. The room they gave him smelled faintly of pine, disinfectant, and regret. The curtains hung heavy and yellowed by years of sun, and the bed looked like it had seen more tears than sleep. But he didn't notice any of that. He sat at the desk by the window, fingers tracing patterns into the condensation of the glass. Outside, the town moved slowly, like honey dripping uphill. Eldenwood wasn't the kind of place that changed. It was the kind that waited for what no one really knew. His mind drifted again to the woman at the door. Her calmness wasn't passive. It was forged, the kind of quiet that grows from fighting alone for too long. That boy, if the timelines lined up, if memory was still trustworthy, then it wasn't just some uncanny resemblance. That child could be more than familiar. It could be something else, something that would shift Gregory's world off its hinges. He remembered the stories he once told himself to survive leaving, that Lily had moved on, that she had found someone better, that love wasn't enough in the face of reality. It was easier to paint her as forgetful than to imagine her standing alone at the willow tree, letter in hand, waiting. His father had made sure he left Eldenwood like a soldier sent off to war, bags packed in the middle of the night, promises burned before sunrise. The last time he saw her was through a fogged-up car window, her silhouette shrinking into the distance as if the town itself was swallowing her whole. He never wrote, and when no letters came, he assumed she'd let go. But now, that assumption felt like poison. What if she had written? What if someone else had kept those words from reaching him? His father had been capable of far worse things. That man had buried feelings under concrete and poured ambition over them like cement. Gregory stood and paced the room, trying to shake the storm in his skull. The boy's age wasn't wrong. The math added up. And that resemblance, it wasn't coincidence. You can't argue with a mirror when it looks back at you with your own eyes. Suddenly, the thought of eviction seemed absurd. He hadn't just stepped into an old house this morning. He had stepped into a question that had waited far too long for an answer. Unable to sit still, he left the inn and walked toward the town records office, a squat building with chipped paint and flower beds full of weeds. Inside, a bell rang as he entered, and a woman behind the desk looked up with the bored interest of someone who hadn't had real work in weeks. "Need help with property records?" she asked, tapping a chipped pen against her mug. Gregory nodded. He didn't say much, just handed over the address. The woman clicked her tongue, squinted at her computer screen, and printed off a file with slow fingers. She handed it to him and returned to her crossword. He sat down on the wooden bench near the window and opened the file. His eyes scanned the tenant information. And there it was. Name, Sarah Claremont. His breath caught. His hand gripped the page until the edges bent beneath his fingers. Claremont. Not a common name around here. And then another line. Next of kin, Lily Claremont, deceased. Time stopped. He stared at those words until they blurred. She was gone. Lily. The girl he had once loved so fiercely it felt like flying. Dead 2 years ago. That explained the absence, the silence, the hollow look in Sarah's eyes. Grief does that. It hollows you out and leaves just enough skin behind to make people think you're fine. He sat there, heart pounding like a fist against a locked door. Sarah wasn't just a tenant. She was hers. And that boy, he wasn't just familiar. He was his. Gregory sat in his car for a long time after leaving the records office, his fingers still curled around the paper like it might vanish if he let it go. Outside, Eldenwood rolled on as if nothing had changed, as if the name Sarah Claremont hadn't detonated quietly inside his chest. It was a town that swallowed secrets the way trees drank rain, without fuss, without sound. He stared at the sidewalk, at people walking past with groceries and coffee cups, unaware that the man behind the tinted glass was unraveling thread by thread. The knowledge weighed heavier than he expected. The girl he once would have given the world to protect had died alone, and the daughter she left behind was now living in that same decaying house, with a child who looked like someone had plucked him from Gregory's memory and given him skin. The more he tried to reason with it, the more it made sense, and yet none of it felt real. He wasn't a father. He'd never been a husband. He'd lived his life with precision, meetings, flights, properties, profits. He wasn't the kind of man who left a legacy of anything but wealth. And yet, here was a legacy he never asked for. One carved not from money or steel, but from moments lost and letters never sent. Back at the inn, he paced the floor of his room like a man whose hands couldn't stay still because his mind was too loud. He pulled out his old leather briefcase, something he rarely touched these days, and began sifting through documents that had nothing to do with Sarah or Lily or the boy. Yet his fingers moved through the pages aimlessly, as though trying to find something that might prove this life of his, this well-tailored illusion, still made sense. But it didn't, and it never had. Somewhere between the boardrooms and high-rises, he had stopped being a man and started being a machine, one built to build, to buy, to conquer. Love had become a faded word, romance a language he'd unlearned out of necessity. Yet Lily had remained, an ember buried deep in his ribs. She had been the one soft truth in a world that demanded armor. And now, knowing she was gone, that she had likely died, wondering why he never came back, never wrote, never even called, it carved something sharp and cold into his stomach. He could feel it now, crawling up his spine like ice water. Regret had come home to roost, and it brought questions with it. Did she hate him in the end? Did she tell Sarah about him with bitterness or longing? Did she protect her daughter from the truth, or did she tell her that he simply disappeared like a coward under the cover of night? The next morning, he returned to the house. He didn't knock this time. He parked across the street, engine off, sitting in stillness as the world turned slowly around him. From this distance, the house looked even more worn, like it was being held together by sheer will. He watched the windows, half expecting Sarah to draw the curtains closed as if sensing his presence, but nothing moved. After a few minutes, the door opened and the boy stepped out, bundled in a sweater too big for him, dragging a toy truck by a frayed string. He stopped at the edge of the porch and squatted near a patch of dirt, where weeds grew stubborn and proud. Moments later, Sarah followed, a mug in her hand, wrapped in a shawl. She said something to the boy and smiled, just a little, the corners of her mouth lifting like old hinges creaking open. That smile hit Gregory like a punch. It was Lily's smile. Not similar. Not close. It was hers. Sarah sat on the steps, rubbing her hands together to warm them. She looked thinner than he remembered from the door, not fragile, but worn, like a soldier after too many campaigns. A woman who had been carrying more weight than the world had any right to place on her shoulders. And still, there she sat, calm in the cold, with no idea that across the street sat the man whose name was a ghost in her family's past. He didn't approach. He didn't dare. Instead, he drove back into town and stopped at the only place that sold anything resembling food, a small cafe called Jones, where the booths were cracked leather and the coffee tasted like it had been brewing since the Carter administration. He ordered toast and eggs he didn't intend to eat, then pulled out a pen and a notepad from the server tray beside the counter. His hands hovered, unsure where to begin. What did one write to the daughter of the only woman he ever loved? How could a man explain 3 decades of silence without sounding like a villain, a fool, or worse, a liar? He scribbled and scratched out, started and stopped, until at last words began to form. "You don't know me," he wrote, then paused. That wasn't right. She did know him, just not the truth of him. He tried again. "There are things I should have said a long time ago. Things you deserve to know." He paused again, staring out the window as the trees swayed like slow dancers in the breeze. The truth had waited long enough. He could run from it, bury it, try to silence it with more work, more buildings, more meetings, but it would always find its way back. Sometimes in a laugh, sometimes in a pair of green eyes, sometimes in a child playing with a toy truck on a sagging porch. He folded the note, tucked it into his coat pocket, and left the cafe without finishing his food. This time he was ready to knock again, but not as a landlord, not as a stranger. This time he'd knock as the man who never came back, because he was never allowed to. And now all that remained was to tell the truth, and hope it didn't burn everything else to ash. It was late afternoon when Gregory found himself back in front of the house, standing just beyond the porch like a trespasser on sacred ground. The letter he'd written burned against the inside of his coat pocket, crinkled from being folded and unfolded too many times. He hadn't slept much the night before. His dreams had been restless things, flickers of Lily running through tall grass, her laughter echoing in a place his adult mind could no longer reach. In those dreams, she always looked back at him, just before disappearing into the fog, her expression unreadable. Guilt didn't come with sirens or warnings. It crept in slowly, building itself like frost along a window until one day you realized you couldn't see out anymore. That was what this was. Years of silence hardening into regret. And now, the moment had come to do what he should have done decades ago. He walked up the porch slowly, each step aching beneath his weight. The wood groaned again, though now it didn't feel like protest. It felt like memory. The door was slightly ajar, not open enough to seem inviting, but just wide enough to make him wonder if he was expected. He raised his hand and knocked anyway, the sound dull against the soft hum of wind in the trees. Sarah opened the door with that same unreadable calm, her face giving away nothing. The boy wasn't in sight, and Gregory noticed her hands were damp, perhaps from washing dishes, or maybe from nerves. They stared at each other for a beat too long. He wasn't sure what words to reach for, so he offered the letter. She looked at it but didn't take it right away. Her eyes moved from his face to the envelope and back again, as if trying to judge whether it was safe to accept whatever history he was about to unfold. After another moment, she reached out and took it, but didn't open it. Instead, she stepped aside, giving him space to enter without a word. The room inside was small, warm, lived in. A faint scent of lavender and lemon soap hung in the air. On the wall above the mantel was a photograph in a chipped wooden frame, Lily, years younger, holding a baby wrapped in a blanket with a look that could have torn Gregory in half if he had seen it any sooner. He stared at the picture like it might blink. Sarah offered him a chair and sat across from him, folding her hands in her lap. She didn't open the letter, not yet. The silence between them was thick, but not angry. It felt more like a dam waiting to break. Gregory tried to find his voice, but it felt clumsy in his mouth. "She never told me," he said finally, his words landing between them like dropped glass. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She looked at the letter again, then slid a finger under the seal and opened it without ceremony. Her eyes scanned the page slowly, her expression unchanged. When she finished, she folded the letter neatly and placed it on the table between them. For a long while she didn't speak, and when she finally did, her voice was even. "She did tell me about you. She told me everything when I was old enough to understand what kind of pain it might cause." She paused, then added, "She thought you abandoned her, thought you moved on." The words cut deep, not because they were cruel, but because they weren't. They were honest, and that honesty carried the weight of everything he had failed to say. He wanted to argue, to explain, to spit out the truth in one breath, but it felt wrong, defensive, selfish. So he let her keep talking. "She waited for a long time," Sarah continued. "Not just for letters, for closure, for a sign that she hadn't imagined the whole thing." Her fingers picked at the edge of her sweater sleeve, but her gaze stayed steady. "When I was about 15, she stopped talking about you altogether, like your name had grown too heavy to carry any more." Gregory nodded slowly, eyes cast downward. "My father never gave me those letters," he said quietly. "He made sure she couldn't reach me. I didn't even know about her death until 2 days ago." Sarah absorbed that, showing no visible reaction. But something in the room changed, as if a single, locked window had finally been nudged open just an inch. The boy appeared then, small feet padding across the wooden floor. He clutched a toy truck in one hand and blinked up at Gregory with that same unmistakable stare. Something about his presence softened the air between the two adults. Children, after all, have a way of unraveling tension just by existing. Sarah stood and placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Go play in your room for a bit," she said softly. The child obeyed without question, vanishing into the hallway with the innocence of someone who didn't know the storm that had been circling long before he was born. Gregory watched him go, the quiet closing of the door behind him feeling heavier than it should have. "His name is Caleb," Sarah said after a moment. "He's 5. And no, I didn't come looking for you. I didn't think it would fix anything." Her voice wasn't bitter. It was firm. The kind of firm that comes from someone who has already done the grieving and built something solid from its ruins. Gregory nodded again, feeling like a man trying to stand on ice. "I didn't know," he repeated, but even he was tired of the sound of his own apology. Sarah seemed to understand that too. "It's not about what you didn't know," she replied, standing and walking to the window. "It's about what you choose to do now that you do." And just like that, she had drawn a line. Not a threat, not an invitation, but a boundary, clear as a fence and twice as strong. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows through the glass as the two of them sat in the middle of a story still being written, each of them holding a piece of a broken map. It had been 3 days since Gregory last stepped foot on Sarah's porch. The morning he left, he hadn't said goodbye, nor did she ask when he would return. There was no farewell, no lingering look, only a silence that hung between them like a taut thread stretched to its limit. He'd spent the days back in his room at the Eldenwood Inn, pacing between the walls like a caged animal trying to remember what freedom felt like. The letter had been read. The truth had landed. But what came after truth was something no man could prepare for. He hadn't expected forgiveness, and he certainly didn't feel entitled to it. The past wasn't a locked door. It was a house with all the windows shattered, the cold always finding a way in. He kept returning in his thoughts to Sarah's voice, that unflinching tone that spoke not from anger, but from resilience. Her words lived in his head like a second heartbeat. It's about what you choose to do now that you do. But choice was a luxury Gregory had rarely afforded himself. He had always moved forward, pushing obstacles aside like weeds in a field he didn't care to harvest. Now, however, he stood still. For the first time in years, he was afraid that moving forward might not be his to choose at all. He decided to drive out to the edge of Eldenwood, not to clear his mind, but to revisit something he'd buried long ago. The road took him past the old Claremont house, not the crumbling one Sarah now lived in, but the one Lily had grown up in, a pale yellow cottage tucked into a bend near the river, abandoned now, half swallowed by ivy. It had once smelled like fresh-baked bread and lavender oil, a place where Lily's laughter used to echo through the open windows like music. Now the shutters hung crooked, and the roof had caved in on one side. He parked by the shoulder and stepped out slowly, the gravel crunching beneath his shoes like brittle bones. The wind carried the scent of damp wood and decaying leaves. He approached the house, running his hand along the edge of the rotting fence. It was strange, this act of returning, a kind of self-inflicted haunting. Every step he took felt like peeling off a layer of armor. The closer he got to the porch, the more memory came flooding back. He remembered sneaking in through the back door when her parents were out, her pulling him into the kitchen by the hand, the two of them dancing in socked feet across the tiles to some cassette recording playing low in the background. She had always had a way of making a small room feel like an entire world. He circled around the back and found the door still ajar, leaning off its hinges like it had given up on being useful. He stepped inside. Dust coated everything like snowfall, the silence so deep it roared in his ears. He paused in the middle of what had once been the living room. The fireplace was stuffed with dried leaves, and the couch had collapsed under years of rot. Yet above the mantel, barely clinging to a rusted nail, was a photograph that made him forget to breathe. It was Lily, maybe 17, smiling with a sunflower tucked behind one ear. He remembered taking that photo on his father's camera during one of their secret summer afternoons. Her smile had always been 1,000 things at once: mischief, hope, defiance, and something warm enough to live in. He reached out and took the photo down, brushing the dust away with shaking fingers. Behind it, taped to the wall, was something else. A torn envelope. His name was written on it in the same curved handwriting he'd once known by heart. It had never been mailed. Carefully, he opened it and pulled out a single sheet of paper, the ink faded but still legible. It was dated months after he left Eldenwood. In it, Lily wrote about Sarah's birth, about how she named her after a line in a poem he once read to her by the lake. "I thought you'd like that," the letter said. "I wanted you to know she's kind, and she's strong. She has your eyes." Gregory sat down slowly on the edge of a broken armchair, the letter clutched against his chest. The past didn't just rise from the dead, it stood beside him now, breathing down his neck. That evening, he returned to Sarah's home, not with the speech rehearsed, but with the photo and the letter in hand. The sun had already dipped beneath the treetops, casting long shadows across the yard, where Caleb's toy truck still lay forgotten in the grass. He walked up the porch again, but this time, something had shifted in him. He didn't feel like a stranger or a businessman or even a man asking to be understood. He felt like a man carrying a lantern into the dark, unsure what it would illuminate, but knowing he couldn't walk away from it anymore. Sarah answered the door quickly, as though she'd been watching. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not suspicious, just bracing for something. He didn't speak right away. He simply held out the photo and the letter. She took them slowly, her brows furrowing as she looked down at the paper. Minutes passed in silence. She didn't invite him in this time, and he didn't expect her to. After reading the letter, she looked up and studied him, not as a landlord, not as a name her mother whispered on bad nights, but as someone standing on the thin ice of a second chance. "Why now?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Gregory met her gaze, eyes rimmed with something raw. "Because I found something I didn't know I'd lost," he said, "and I don't want to lose it again before I even understand what it is." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Instead, she stepped aside, and this time, when he walked in, he took off his coat and hung it by the door. There was a stillness in the room that night, one that neither of them tried to fill with words. It wasn't silence born from discomfort, but from the fragile understanding that had begun to take root somewhere between the letter, the photograph, and the years that stood between them like weary gatekeepers. Gregory sat in the corner armchair, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the cup of untouched tea Sarah had handed him. She sat across from him, not curled or relaxed, but upright, as if posture alone could guard against the weight of everything they had let into the room. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting shifting gold across her features, giving her a warmth that memory didn't quite match, but honored just the same. Caleb had gone to bed without much fuss, too young to know what had passed between his mother and the man who now sat in his living room, like someone trying to remember how to breathe. There were no accusations. No lecturas. Sarah spoke little. She didn't need to. Her presence carried volumes. Gregory knew that words could never rewrite what had already been lived, but he needed, to stitch together something from the pieces that remained, something that might resemble a bridge, something that didn't end in a locked door or another vanished figure. At one point, she stood and walked to the bookshelf against the far wall, rummaging through a row of old photo albums until she found the one with a faded leather spine. She brought it over and placed it between them on the coffee table, her fingers lingering on the cover before opening it. Page after page revealed pieces of a life he had never been part of. Caleb as a newborn, asleep on his mother's chest, Lily standing beside Sarah on her first day of school, her smile thinner, wearier, but still unmistakable. There was a photo of Sarah at maybe 9 or 10, standing by the willow tree with a book in her hand, looking off to the side. Gregory felt something stir when he saw it. That tree had witnessed more truth than any courtroom ever had. She kept flipping, slowly, until she stopped at a page where two photos were tucked into a clear sleeve, side by side. One of them was a much younger Lily, beaming with her arm around a boy that Gregory recognized instantly. Himself. It was a picture he didn't even know existed. He had no memory of it being taken. The other photo, more recent, was of Caleb, caught mid-laugh, eyes wide, teeth missing. The resemblance between the two images was undeniable. Sarah didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Gregory leaned forward slightly, hand brushing the corner of the album. "He looks like her when he smiles," he said, voice low and rough. "But the eyes, I see too much of myself in them." She nodded faintly and closed the album, pressing her hand gently against the cover, as though it were a living thing. They didn't speak of the future that night. It was too soon for plans, too raw for promises. But something in the air had shifted, an invisible thread drawn between them, not tight, not tangled, but present. Gregory stayed longer than he meant to, and when he finally rose to leave, Sarah walked him to the door. He paused in the frame, unsure whether to look back or walk forward. The question hovered in the space between them like dust and sunlight. "I don't want to disappear again," he said quietly, eyes searching hers for something he couldn't name. "But I'll follow your lead, Sarah. I won't step where I'm not welcome." She leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, eyes steady. "You're not unwelcome," she replied, choosing each word carefully. "But you are unknown. To me. To Caleb. You'll have to earn that place if you still want it." He nodded once, not with pride but with gratitude. He had spent his life building kingdoms out of concrete and glass. Now, for the first time, he would have to build something with patience, something human. She didn't offer a hug or a handshake. Instead, she closed the door softly behind him, and he walked away into the quiet of the street, the stars above him blinking like they were trying to remember his name. Over the weeks that followed, he returned. Not every day, and never unannounced. Sometimes he brought groceries. Other times, books for Caleb. He never stayed long at first, just enough to show that he was still there, still trying. Caleb was cautious but curious. Sarah remained guarded but consistent. The three of them began orbiting each other like slow-moving planets, their paths shaped by gravity but not yet colliding. One afternoon, Gregory arrived with a box of old belongings he dug out from storage in his city apartment. Photos, notebooks, one of Lily's bracelets she had left in his jacket pocket years ago. Sarah accepted it without a word, her hands trembling just slightly as she lifted the bracelet from the box and turned it over in her palm. It was nothing fancy, just a simple beaded string with a copper charm shaped like a leaf. But she stared at it like it held a secret her mother never told her. That night after he left, Sarah sat alone on the porch long after the sky had gone dark, the bracelet still in her hand. She wasn't sure yet what Gregory's presence would mean in the long run, but something inside her, the same part that had hardened itself into stone over the years, had begun to soften, just slightly, like frost surrendering to spring. Sometimes life takes us far from where we started, far from people we loved, mistakes we made, and the things we left unsaid. But no matter how long it's been, healing can begin with honesty. Don't wait until it's too late to say the words that matter. Love doesn't need perfect timing. It just needs courage. And when you finally choose truth over pride, bridges begin to build where walls once stood. May your heart always be strong enough to face the past and soft enough to receive forgiveness. May the people who are meant to find you, even if it takes years and tears. May broken ties be mended, lost time be redeemed, and may your love speak louder than your silence. May your house never lack laughter, and may your soul never run out of peace. And when life hands you second chances, may you have the wisdom to hold them with both hands. In healing, in hope, and in the beauty of starting over, may it be so. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.